has been my privilege, along with Alberto Ares, co-chair, to serve with other colleagues on the Task Force on Solidarity with Migrants and Refugees. The work of the task force has been a practical one, and we do, as you'll see, have some specific proposals that we hope to share this afternoon. But it's also been, like everything at the IAJU meeting, spiritual work, evoking in each of us a deeper compassion for the children, women, and men who are forcibly displaced from their homes and livelihoods daily in our world. The face of Christ in each of them guides us as universities and as companions. It is our true north. Today, our panel presenters will be presenting both in English and in Spanish. So if you're using translation equipment, you may find yourself going back and forth just a bit. And we want to thank Father Christie, of course, and Father Garanzini for the opportunity to dialogue with you this morning, or this afternoon. And we also thank each member of every other task force whose work inspires and intersects with the needs of migrants and refugees. I'll start by introducing our panelists as well as other members of the task force who I'll ask to stand when their name is called, who are present at the assembly. So here on the panel is Father Alberto Ares, co-chair, regional director of JRS Europe. Father Rampe Lobo, migration delegate for the Southern African province. Father David Hollenbach, faculty at Georgetown University. Arnoud Mertens, international director of programs and innovation at JRS. Delia Popescu, faculty at Lemoyne College. Maria Vidal de Aimes, faculty at Loyola University, Chicago. And also here with us are Armando Borja, chief operating officer at Jesuit Worldwide Learning. Please stand. Father Alejandro Olayo Mendez, seated on the end here, faculty at Boston College. Father Martin Putusari, director of the newly established Migrant Assistant and Information Network, MAIN, which is addressing the needs of migrants in 16 of the provinces of India. And Joan Rosenauer, here in the front, executive director of JRS USA. Soon, joining us by Zoom is Farishta Sardari, our student speaker, who will be introduced in a moment. So our conversation today will, in some ways, be kind of like a teaspoon in the ocean. There are many important migrant and refugee serving works and initiatives already in Jesuit higher education. We know that. Many of you could stand up and speak eloquently on things, very compelling projects that are happening in your schools. And therefore, it is impossible to address them all in one session. But our hope is to underscore 2 points. That better connecting these efforts will make them more credible and impactful, and that the gospel calls all of us to find even deeper ways and more creative ways to stand in solidarity. So now I'll ask Alberto to come forward and offer us some context.
Buenas tardes. Como todos sabemos, las migraciones son parte de la historia de la humanidad. Las personas se han desplazado y se seguirán moviendo porque la migración es parte de un proceso más amplio de transformación social en búsqueda de oportunidades y mejores medios de vida. En las últimas décadas, el refugio y la migración forzada han ganado más visibilidad y atención, revelando una gama de sistemas migratorios y crisis humanitarias. Como muchos migrantes, Ignacio de Loyola vivió buena parte de su vida en el camino, como itinerante y peregrino, experimentando una fuerte llamada a seguir a Jesús pobre y humilde. Para Ignacio y para todos nosotros, la cercanía y el servicio a los pobres lleva a la amistad con Cristo y genera con ellos una nueva familia. Más recientemente, la Segunda Preferencia Apostólica Universal impulsa a la Compañía de Jesús a caminar junto a los pobres, los descartados de este mundo, aquellos cuya dignidad es vulnerada en una misión de reconciliación y justicia. Desde esta perspectiva, nuestro grupo ha desarrollado su trabajo en los últimos años y con ilusión hoy os presentamos parte de los resultados alcanzados y también varias propuestas para seguir caminando. Estamos muy ilusionados con vuestra presencia y también vuestras aportaciones. Y por eso hemos preparado algo para que podamos estar juntos, ¿no? Para poder incorporar todas vuestras sugerencias, preguntas y aportaciones, os invitamos a conectaros con vuestro celular, vuestro móvil, ¿no? Con este código para que podáis hacer a través de una aplicación, pero es muy sencilla, donde podéis proponer preguntas y comentarios que iremos atendiendo durante las exposiciones. Alejandro nos ayudará con ello y en especial en el turno de preguntas. También os diremos que incluso mañana podremos avanzar un poco más en la sesión de mañana en el aula 214. Bueno, con esta introducción le vamos a pedir a please, George, let's move to Zoom. And we want to welcome our student, Farishta. Welcome, Farishta.
Thank you very much.
We are very happy to have you with us and to hear your testimony. Let me introduce, first of all, Farishta Sardari, an Afghani national presently residing in Italy. Farishta is an alumna from the Jesuit Worldwide Learning at Regis University Program and Creighton University Bachelor's Degree in Leadership Studies. Welcome, Farishta. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello to all. I am happy to speak to you during this session that invites Jesuit universities to think about what they can do to ease the suffering of refugees. I have my own answer. That is, please offer the opportunity to refugees like me to study at your institutions. In my case, I was offered the opportunity through a collaboration among Jesuit Worldwide Learning, Regis University, and Creighton University. Here I share with you my journey. I am Farishta Sardari from Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, millions of girls cannot go to school today. I come from a small village in one of the least developed provinces in Afghanistan. I belong to a family of 10. Families to survive depend on agriculture and livestock. My family was like that. As a young girl, my responsibility was to be a shepherd, to look after the animals. In 2012, when I was in 9th grade, Joris started offering English lessons in my village. I gladly joined this English course. I'm grateful to my parents for their support. And instead of asking my siblings and me to do household chores, our parents encouraged us to study English and excel in our schooling. School and English courses offered me an excellent opportunity to define a new horizon and overcome the barriers hindering my personal growth. I identified my strengths and learned to dream of a better future for myself and my family. After 2 years of studying English, I learned that JW would support up to 50 girls students to continue their English studies in Bamiyan, the city where the big Buddhas formerly stood. It was unheard of for parents to send their girl children away for studies. In January 2015, my classmates and I headed to Bamiyan, and we studied the higher level of English. This training allowed me to become an English teacher so that I could share my newly acquired skills with others in my village. In 2016, I was hoping to start university studies. However, my father could not afford to pay the university fees, so I had to turn down an admission offer. According to an Afghan saying, there will be light in the darkness. Living in hopeless moments, I learned of a 3-year university online diploma in the liberal arts offered by JW in collaboration with Regis University. My community teaching and leadership helped me be chosen for the Regis diploma. That is when I saw my dreams start to unfold. I completed the Regis diploma after 3 years of study. The Regis University diploma allowed me to connect in a global classroom. with other JWL students worldwide through the LMS platform provided by Georgetown University. Through discussion boards, we exchange our cultural diversity and lifestyles. I learned many things I had never thought of before, including studying courses in leadership, world religions, ethics and human person, science, sociology, introduction to business, marketing, entrepreneurship, and so many others. Perhaps world religions was one of my favorite subjects. This subject has incredibly changed my perspective and helped me dispel stereotypes about other religions. It also allowed me to learn more about other people's beliefs, cultures, customs, and languages. Upon graduation from the religious diploma, my classmates and I knew it was time for us to give back to our communities. JWL offered us teaching opportunities to serve as English teachers in their Cambridge Global English Language Program. We were each responsible for over 150 students in several geographical districts in the Daikundi, Kor, and Lal provinces. JWL was also aware that the future of any program in Afghanistan would depend on local student leadership. A few of my classmates and I registered a local NGO to ensure that higher education opportunities, particularly for girls, could continue. The New Horizon Human Welfare and Development Organization was launched in 2019. This organization will prove fundamental to ensuring that more than 1,500 JWL students will continue attending English and other academic programs after the fall of the government to the Taliban. In 2018, JWL also determined that many young student leaders needed to upgrade their education to the bachelor's degree level. At that time, Creighton University had generously offered several scholarships to pursue an online bachelor's degree in leadership studies. I graduated with a special mention as a member of Creighton University's Honor Society after a little over 4 years of study while living in exile in Italy during the last year. While all was going well until August 2021. When the Taliban took over the country, I was forced to leave the country because of the horrible violence. JWL concern for our safety helped me and my colleagues flee Afghanistan to Italy on 26th of August 2021. It has been almost 1 year that I have been in Italy as a refugee, and I continue to support my peers back home. Most recently, I have joined the staff of JWL to support its global English language program worldwide. The situation in Afghanistan is terrifying, and the Taliban has put many strict limitations on women and girls. From the fall of the Afghan government until now, many schools continue to be closed, affecting especially girl students. Our NGO New Horizon is still operating with the support of JWL. It conducts English courses for over 900 students and delivers to over 100 students in courses in e-commerce and web design accredited by St. Joseph's University in Bangalore. Peace leadership in partnership with Hakima University College in Kenya. Learning facilitator accredited by the Catholic University of Eichstätt in Germany. And a bachelor degree in sustainable development accredited by the Zawiya Institute of Management University in India, with coursework transferred from the Newman Institute in Sweden. I am most appreciative of New Horizon students that stepped in as teachers and leaders once many of us were forced to leave them behind. On behalf of my sisters and brothers in Afghanistan, I would like to thank JWL for working with the excluded like my peers and me, and for giving us hope by mobilizing the Jesuit universities mentioned before. I hope other Jesuit universities present in this meeting follow their lead. In closing, this journey for me has been a light in the darkness, and I hope it serves as an inspiration for others to follow in my steps and become future leaders committed to making the world more peaceful and human. Thank you. everyone.
Thank you very much, Farishta, for your testimony and for your courage. It's a great example to all of us. Greetings to Italy. Now, in our presentation, we move on to the reality of forced migration and its challenges and opportunities from our colleagues Rampe and Arnaud. Thank you both for your contributions.
Thank you, Alberto. And good afternoon, everybody. After this powerful personal testimony, let me move to the very macro and provide you with a few figures on forcible displacement, which then will also help to set the scene for the examples and case studies that my colleagues will present. And I start with stating the obvious, and that is that we are dealing with a very large phenomenon. As we are speaking now, there is over 100 million forcibly displaced people, over 100 million women, men, and children who have been forced to leave their homes. 100 million means over 1% of the world's population. It means 1 out of 78 people. And it is also a growing phenomenon, a rapidly growing. So less than 10 years ago, in 2012, there were about 42 million people on the move, which then was already thought to be a rather challenging situation. It moved to 65 million 5 years ago. And unfortunately, the outlook is one of growth, which, of course, in the business we are in, is not exactly a good thing. And the reason for future growth even in the next couple of years includes the consequences of climate change, for instance. And as if more complexity were needed, it is important to know that it is ever less a temporary phenomenon. Forced displacement has become increasingly protracted. On average, refugees spend 20 years abroad, which means that if you end up in a refugee camp, it is quite likely that you spend 2 decades of your life there. And the reasons for the protracted situation is because the conditions people flee from have become increasingly protracted, as also my colleague Rampe will explain. This slide shows the main countries of where refugees come from. Let me immediately say this is a situation at the end of 2021, so this does not yet include Ukraine, which, as we know, has in about 5 months produced over 6 and probably more million refugees, people who have left the country, and about the same number of people who are internally displaced in the country. But this is probably a good slide to also remind us of crises that then quickly tend to be forgotten. If we look from left to right, in Central America, Venezuela is the biggest refugee situation there, with over 4.6 million people who have left the country, the Caminantes. Syria, of course, is still well on our minds, with close to 7 million people who left, and the same figure of displaced people inside the country. In Africa, there's several countries, but South Sudan still has the highest number, and it has grown, unfortunately, still over the last year. And then, of course, we know Afghanistan, and a situation that we probably know less about, at least in general public opinion, is Myanmar and the Rohingya situation there. Thank you. So where do these people go to? General public opinion all too often thinks that most of these people move to Europe or to countries like the US or Australia. Reality is quite different. First of all, not over half of these people don't leave their country, so they become what we call internally displaced, and they are being categorized as IDPs, internally displaced people. And of course, also these people are de facto refugees, and the ministries of the Society of Jesus dealing with forcible displacement, of course, also work with them. And of those who cross their borders, so who leave their countries, over 3/4, 75%, end up in neighboring countries, which means that it is above all low and middle income countries that host the bulk of refugees. It is only 17% of these people who move to high income countries, like the countries most of us live in. Now, I have been giving you statistics and numbers. Of course, for us here together, this is not about statistics. This is about 100 million individual people with their needs and so on. And my colleagues will speak more about that.
Thank you so much. Moving on to the next one. Why do they leave? We've heard a lot about conflicts. According to the Global Conflict Tracker, we have about 27, plus minus 27 live conflicts going on in the world today. And we've been hearing a lot in the news about Ukraine nowadays. But there are also other protracted situations like Yemen, which has been experiencing conflict for the past 6 years or so, with over 2.2 million children being displaced. Afghanistan, Somalia, the Sahel region in Africa, Burkina Faso, DRC, Central African Republic, South Sudan. All those places, they've been experiencing conflict and violence, which has forced people to leave what they would normally call home. We also have a situation of poverty and unemployment. Most of the countries of origin, or the sending countries as it were, have their unemployment rates in double digits. And Africa has most of its able-bodied people being unemployed or living below the poverty line. And that forces people to move or to leave home and look for better life and seek greener pastures elsewhere, as it were. We have a situation where there is also cultural and religious differences or intolerances, which causes conflict and force people to move or to leave their homes. The situation of lack of education and access to health facilities, especially in poor countries in our continent where I come from in Africa, there's a lot of that happening, people moving from one area to another to get either education, access to education, or to medical facilities, because in their countries, their countries cannot afford them or offer them those services. So maybe from a Catholic social teaching perspective, we can say people, they move because they want to preserve and maintain their human dignity and live a dignified life. But we also have nowadays the issue of climate-induced displacement with climate crisis going on at the moment, which forces people to move. We've had extreme weather patterns where it's either too dry or too wet, and people experiencing floods. We've had a lot of that in the eastern part of Africa, where we have, like in Mozambique and Malawi and Zimbabwe, we've had several cyclones hitting those parts of our continent. What do they experience after fleeing? Of course, they experience all sorts of challenges, but the needs remain the same. They have the basic human needs, like, you know, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, including Wi-Fi nowadays, as we all do. And for us, for example, in South Africa, asylum seekers now, they have to apply for renewal of their permits online, and data and a lack of access of Wi-Fi has become a serious challenge when it comes to renewing of permits for asylum seekers and migrants. So Wi-Fi or data for application of renewal of their permits has become one of the basic needs, including, of course, accommodation, education for their children. And so Second, the other thing that we look at, the trauma. We realize that not only from the country of origin or the country of transit do they experience a traumatic experience, they have traumatic experiences, but even in host countries, there's a lot of trauma that is going on, either through institutionalized or individual xenophobic or Afrophobia or Islamophobia experiences. They continue to experience trauma, to have those traumatic experiences. Some of these experiences further traumatize the migrants and makes it difficult for them to recover or to pick up the pieces, as it were. The lack of social networks when they get to the host countries is also a challenge that they face. But what is also important, we see now countries more and more becoming difficult when it comes to offering asylum or documentation, and refusing them or denying them self-reliance and access to livelihoods activities, that is employment activities also. So that also further causes a violation of their human dignity. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. Appreciate that. We are aware, as we said at the beginning, that there is a lot of good work happening in this IAJU community already, and this will be the briefest of encounters, but we'd like to ask you to turn to someone near you just for a moment and to share something that is happening in your own local campus community, your own college, university, or higher education initiative related to forced migration, because we begin this conversation in a very grassroots way, and then we'll continue with the larger biblical context from David Hollenbach. So please turn just for a minute or two to somebody near you and share a best practice from your own campus. Thank you. We know that is no time at all for a very big conversation. So we'd invite you to come back to the quiet of the group. It's always tough after we start. And I'd like to invite Father David Hollenbach to reflect a little bit on the biblical and Catholic context for our life in solidarity with migrants and refugees. So, Father David Hollenbach.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much. Why should Jesuit universities direct their teaching, research, and service to assist these migrants and refugees we've just heard about? My response to that why question has two aspects: religious and ethical. First, assisting migrants and refugees is close to the heart of the religious and Christian inspiration of Jesuit education. The Bible tells us that God has deep concern for displaced people. The book of Exodus tells us that the origin of the people of Israel was God's special concern for them when they were displaced from their homes to Egypt. We read, quote, "The Lord said, I have witnessed the affliction of my people in Egypt, and I have come down to rescue them." Since God has concern for the alien and the displaced, believers should also. The book of Deuteronomy tells us, quote, "The Lord your God befriends the alien, so you too must befriend the alien, for you were once aliens yourself in Egypt." God's care for the refugee is also embodied in the very life of Jesus. St. Matthew's Gospel tells us that just after Jesus' birth, quote, "An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him.'" End of quote. Following this designation, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph themselves met today's legal definition of being refugees, where they fled persecution across a national border, which is the official international definition of a refugee. So it is not surprising, since Jesus was a refugee, that Jesus teaches us that at the last judgment, those who welcome the stranger are welcoming Christ himself, and will in turn be welcomed into the kingdom of heaven. Now, of course, we know that no one country can welcome all the 100 million refugees and forced migrants in the world today. But the U.S. bishops have told us a number of years ago that the ultimate injustice is to be treated as if one were a non-member of the human race. This surely applies to most refugees, for they have lost, in most cases, virtually everything. But we also need criteria to determine priorities, ethical criteria to determine priorities among the duties to refugees and migrants and our duties to our own people. National borders are important, but they are not absolute. Duties across borders to people like refugees and forced migrants, I think, take priority over duties to our fellow citizens under several conditions. First, when others are in great need, greater need than we are, as are all refugees, at least in comparison to those of us in the United States. When we are proximate to those in great need, like Poland and the European Union are proximate to the displaced from the Ukraine. And when we have a capability of providing assistance to these displaced people and can do so without disproportionate burden. These final criteria, it seems to me, are especially relevant to the rich lands of the North, like those of us in the United States and the European Union. For most of the refugees of the world today are being hosted in poor, developing countries. Rich lands, therefore, have a duty to share the burdens presently being carried by the very poor countries of the world, like poor Uganda, which is hosting over 1 million refugees from South Sudan, or like Lebanon, which is hosting within its borders 1 out of every 4 people inside the borders of Lebanon is a refugee, 1 out of 4 in a country that is of only moderate income. These priorities, as well as the motivation that comes to us from our understanding of God's concern for the refugees, it seems to me, show us why Jesuit universities should be responding to the needs of people on the move. And I hope we can continue our discussion of how to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, David. In light of this international context and of the call of our own faith to act, today we are highlighting 3 very different university projects serving migrants and refugees. And to stir the pot of discussion, really, regarding what each Jesuit university might do in its own context and its own culture. These demonstration projects are by no means exhaustive, but they do represent a broad range of possibilities. The first is a multi-university and multi-apostolic effort called Caminar Contigo, and I'd ask Maria to share a bit about it now.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to share some of our rich experiences with Jesuit ministries and university partnerships that support migrants and refugees while benefiting the teaching, research, and service missions of our institutions of higher education. We're aware that every region and context is unique, and there are different ways in which the Jesuit social apostolate and institutions of higher education work together. Yet perhaps our experience can provide some insights into how Jesuit ministries and institutions of higher education can partner to respond to the plight of migrants, and refugees, and contribute to the formation of men and women with and for others. Such partnerships build on the wealth of experience of NGOs, in this case, Jesuit Refugee Service USA, in responding to humanitarian crisis, as they provide comprehensive accompaniment with migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, and forcibly displaced persons regionally and globally. Each year, JRS accompanies over 1 million people who have been forced to flee their homes in more than 55 countries around the world. One of their priorities is providing mental health and psychosocial support for people who have experienced the trauma of fleeing their homes, often in perilous situations with few, if any, protections. Mental health programs are critical to their well-being and can also play an important role in their efforts to advance a legal case for asylum. JRS has found that partnerships with institutions of higher education have provided important support to their programs and in many ways have helped strengthen these initiatives around the world. Our current project also builds on the experience of several binational inter-university partnerships for field-based learning and immersion courses focused on migration and psychosocial accompaniment. This year marks the 15th anniversary of such a collaboration between Loyola University Chicago, the Universidad Iberoamericana of Mexico City and Puebla, ITESO, the Jesuit University of Guadalajara, Jesuit Migrant Services of Mexico, and Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Chicago. The faculty at partnering institutions provide training and supervision to students as they complete their internships abroad and engage in collaborative research. To date, this two-way exchange has included approximately 300 US and Mexican students in term-long migration-focused placements abroad, providing humanitarian aid and social-emotional support. In addition to internship exchanges, immersion courses have included even more Jesuit NGOs, such as the Kino Border Initiative, and have involved a larger number of students and Jesuit universities and schools. We are sure that in your regions, many of you may have similar experiences. Projects engaging issues related to human mobility and forced displacement should be driven by the needs emerging in the field. These emergent needs challenge us to creatively collaborate in developing coordinated responses that contribute to our understanding of complex social issues while providing comprehensive accompaniment of migrants and forcibly displaced people. Loyola Chicago and Boston College Schools of Social Work, the Universidad Iberoamericana, Ciudad Mexico, and Puebla, and ITESO have partnered in a new JRS USA initiative, Caminar Contigo, which aims to address the mental health and psychosocial well-being of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and other displaced people in the Ciudad Juárez and El Paso region. In partnership with JRS USA, participating universities have developed a project titled A Curriculum and Internship Model for Socio-Emotional Care and Mental Health Services in Migration Crisis Situations. This project seeks to develop, pilot, evaluate, and disseminate an internship model and curriculum designed to prepare our students for interprofessional practice in migration crisis situations as they work with JRS Caminar Contigo program to support migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees stranded at the US-Mexico border due to the policies of the US government. More specifically, the project goals include the development of a robust training model consisting of field-based and online learning opportunities that prepare students to provide psychosocial accompaniment and mental health support with asylum seekers in these situations. The development of materials that can be used in similar programs for training purposes in diverse humanitarian situations requiring mental health and psychosocial support services. And thirdly, the creation of an internship and training model that provides protocols and tools for student engagement in the field, supervision, and evaluation. This is just one example of an interinstitutional Jesuit collaboration that can advance our respective missions and contribute to the forming of mental health professionals that understand the reality of human mobility and can in solidarity accompany migrants in the construction of a more inclusive local and global community. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, María. El segundo proyecto se titularía así: ¿Cómo ayudar a nuestras universidades a crecer en una cultura de la hospitalidad? Sabemos que la cálida acogida de las personas migrantes y refugiadas es uno de los pilares de una sociedad verdaderamente humana. La hospitalidad es la expresión cristiana de la acogida del otro. La cultura de la hospitalidad abre el cerrojo de nuestras fronteras interiores, motivando la apertura de fronteras geográficas y simbólicas de exclusión entre países y también en las grandes ciudades. La acción de la Iglesia en esta cultura del encuentro y de la hospitalidad se inspira en los valores evangélicos, en línea con las directrices del Papa Francisco. Este proyecto que os presentamos hoy se nutre principalmente de dos iniciativas en Iberoamérica: Hospitalidad.es en España y Soy H en América Latina y el Caribe. Un grupo de trabajo que constituyó una verdadera comunidad de discernimiento en común, integrado por los responsables de los distintos programas de hospitalidad, en conexión directa con los responsables en terreno de los múltiples proyectos locales donde están insertas nuestras universidades, junto a diversas comunidades migrantes. Sabemos que nuestras raíces ignacianas, principalmente la Congregación General 35 en el 2008, insistió en la necesidad de que las comunidades y las obras jesuitas den testimonio al mundo de la hospitalidad. Si recordáis también, el padre Nicolás puso la hospitalidad en el centro de la misión jesuita como un valor humano y cristiano que estamos llamados a promover y practicar en un mundo de fronteras cerradas. La Congregación General 36 nos invita a crear una cultura de la hospitalidad, como lo recuerda el Papa Francisco y el Padre Arturo Sosa en numerosas ocasiones. Por tanto, nos acercamos a la hospitalidad desde una mirada integral, incorporada al ciclo de nuestra misión con migrantes, refugiados y personas desplazadas, desde el acompañamiento, el servicio, la investigación, la sensibilización y el advocacy, la incidencia pública. Un ciclo donde podemos incorporar las capacidades que las distintas instituciones, incluidas las universidades, aportan en una respuesta común, como se puede ver en este diagrama. De hecho, pues este es un ejemplo de Hospitalidad.es, donde las universidades jesuitas en España, Comillas, Deusto, ESADE, IQS, La Loyola, pues participaron también como uno de los partners junto a otras instituciones. La misma GM Migration, la Global Ignition Advocacy Network Migraciones, planteó en el 2020 también como una prioridad promover una genuina cultura de la hospitalidad y la solidaridad. ¿Cuál es la metodología de trabajo que hicimos y de dónde sacamos también los elementos clave, ¿no? Estudiamos un panel de buenas prácticas en el ámbito de la hospitalidad, describiendo los elementos que han ayudado a nuestras universidades a implicarse en una cultura de la hospitalidad, así como los puntos débiles. En primer lugar, una vez realizado el estudio y el discernimiento de nuestro trabajo y en los distintos programas, elaboramos unos criterios basándonos en la experiencia de trabajo Y fuimos acercando el zoom también de hasta que dimos con 8 buenas prácticas de hospitalidad. De esas buenas prácticas vienen de países como España, Colombia, México, Venezuela y Brasil. ¿Cuáles son los elementos clave? Y con esto concluyo para crecer en una cultura de la hospitalidad. 1. Responder a una llamada prioritaria de la Compañía de Jesús o de la Iglesia. 2. Responder a nuestro contexto, es decir, a una necesidad que tenemos al nivel local o regional. 3. El servicio a la comunidad, no es para mirarnos al ombligo ni para nosotros mismos. 4. El trabajo en red con otra institución jesuita especializada, como las que hemos hablado hoy aquí, o otras de otros sectores. Un enfoque holístico e integral desde una mirada, mirando todos los recursos que la universidad puede poner al servicio del bien común. Y, por último, un apoyo institucional. Nos hemos dado cuenta en todo el trabajo que en las universidades donde existe un compromiso firme por parte de la universidad de integrar la movilidad humana en su planificación apostólica, dotándola de recursos humanos y económicos, esto pues ha hecho que se haya podido crecer. Solo nos queda agradecer todo este camino recorrido e invitar a crecer en una cultura de la hospitalidad caminando juntos. Voy a dar ahora paso a Dilia para que nos pueda hablar del tercer proyecto. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Alberto. I'm going to try to very briefly introduce you to a research project that has just some preliminary findings. So this is not completed, and I invite all of you to join us in completing it. The question we are trying to address in our research is to what extent education, action, and reform can be connected to one another in the context of Catholic higher education institutions. The premise of our research is that Catholic social teachings offer the guideposts to connect how we think and especially how we act about social injustice, particularly with respect to migrants and refugees. So we very briefly looked at the attitudes of Catholics on immigration to see how and if they reflect actual Catholic social teachings. Globally, the most important factors are ideology, worldview, generalized levels of trust, and social status. This is according to data in the World Values Survey. As expected, those with more education, those who were more financially secure, and those with a more trusting or global mindset were also more welcoming to immigrants. However, how welcoming they were to immigrants varies by country, even when accounting for all these factors. We also looked a little bit at the United States specifically through the General Social Survey. In the United States, white evangelicals have the least welcoming attitudes, but how do Catholics compare? Interestingly, maybe on average, Catholics are no different in attitudes than evangelicals. Among Catholics, again, predictably perhaps, Republicans and ideological conservatives are least welcoming, while those with more education are more welcoming. What was interesting in our findings is that among the least educated, Catholics are the most accepting. However, when we compared well-educated Catholics to well-educated non-Catholics, religious differences disappeared. And this is a puzzle. The question is why? Our research shows that Catholics, especially educated Catholics, essentially fall into line with the rest of society. The issue in the US is really they're just a broad and structural reflection of the entire society, not just American Catholics. Overall, it is fair to say that Americans are more open to immigration than they were 20 years ago. And it's really the far right that is out of line with the general views. However, the views of the far right tend to dominate the political structure and the political discourse. So in this context, we think that Jesuit higher education institutions should really seriously consider action and involvement to shape civil society discourse and preferences. So we have a series of preliminary suggestions for how that might be done. Jesuit institutions should consider reviving their activist roots to challenge US Catholics to reject anti-immigrant violence and xenophobia. They should follow the example of the Berrigan brothers to act institutionally at what Dan Berrigan called fugitives from injustice. In other words, Catholic higher education institutions need to become political on this issue and support a role of advocacy as hubs for social activism. They should start, Catholic and especially Jesuit higher education institutions should start with an internal reckoning to find a path to structural institutional inclusivity, not just by giving immigrants and refugees a much easier way into the classroom, but by also giving them a seat at the institutional table. Catholic institutions themselves should model the social behavior they want to see in their constituency by proactively hiring migrants and refugees as faculty and staff, and opening their doors to refugees and migrants by systematically reducing financial burdens for these groups. If you're interested in hearing more, I'm happy to share more about this research, but for now, thank you very much for this opportunity to share this.
Thank you so much, Delia. In this moment of the processes, we can say, ¿qué pueden hacer nuestras universidades, nuestros centros de estudios superiores? ¿Cómo podemos crear auténticas comunidades de discernimiento y de solidaridad? Como hemos visto, muchas de nuestras universidades han iniciado el camino hacia un tipo de solidaridad a través de programas académicos, iniciativas de hospitalidad, aprendizaje y servicio e investigación con un foco claro en las migraciones y el refugio, pero hay mucho más por hacer. Comprometiéndonos juntos en la solidaridad con los migrantes y refugiados y coordinando mejor nuestros esfuerzos, podremos responder más eficazmente a las necesidades de nuestros hermanos y hermanas. Siempre que intentamos iniciar o profundizar una estrategia de solidaridad con las personas migrantes y refugiadas en nuestros contextos ignacianos, debemos considerar la importancia del trabajo coordinado y discernido, teniendo en cuenta a todos los agentes involucrados. Este elemento también tiene que impregnar nuestros tres pilares: la investigación, la formación y la transformación social. En este contexto, las universidades y también las instituciones especializadas en la atención de personas migrantes y refugiadas están llamadas a liderar nuestra reflexión en clave de un acercamiento social a la realidad. Desde nuestra dimensión espiritual e institucional estamos llamados a profundizar en un conocimiento ignaciano de la realidad con una mirada integral, que incorpore a todos los agentes desde el discernimiento y la mirada honesta de la realidad, que tienen que ocupar un espacio central. El conocimiento ignaciano de la realidad se realiza mejor en una comunidad de discernimiento. Lo decía hoy el Padre General, ¿no? Un discernimiento que supone arriesgar y abrirse a la novedad. En la reflexión sobre el desplazamiento forzoso, las instituciones especializadas, tales como el JRS, la red del RJM, el Jesuit World War Learning, nuestras redes de advocacy, así como las propias personas migrantes y refugiadas y desplazadas, deberían ocupar un espacio privilegiado en estas comunidades de discernimiento y solidaridad. Estos procesos sabemos que toman tiempo y requieren compromiso personal, grupal, decimos antes que también institucional, no vienen así por así. Así como un trabajo también con los equipos en el terreno o las distintas redes de acogida en los distintos territorios. Lo sabemos también las instituciones especializadas que estamos trabajando en el terreno, pero lo sabéis y lo sabemos también desde nuestras universidades, instituciones especializadas que trabajan especialmente en este campo de las migraciones y el refugio. Muchas gracias.
So, where does this lead us today? We have contextualized ourselves in terms of the reality of migration and refugee life in this very brief time. We have considered the biblical foundations of our own calls as Catholic and Jesuit institutions. We've imagined both in the large group, and the energy was palpable, as well as in the discussion of the demonstration projects, what might be possible or is already happening. The task force has made a proposal to the IAJU that has 4 parts. We'll discuss them very briefly, but the text of the proposal is on pages 55 to 60 of your program booklet, if you care to look. It can also be found by using the QR code on this slide, if that's easier for you, and we're asking each institution to consider these 4 elements in each of our own commitments to the well-being of migrants and refugees and to solidarity as sisters and brothers with them. The first is committing to a set of common principles for engagement for how we approach our solidarity with migrants and refugees. This includes basic principles on working with each other as universities and colleges and with refugee-serving apostolates. It includes responding to local community needs, and it includes approaching the entire project of solidarity in a spirit of prayer and hope. It's lengthier in your document, but those are the essentials. The second piece of the proposal is to ask scholars at your institution who are involved in any kind of research related to migration and refugees. That could be in engineering, it could be in the arts, it could be in literature, it could be across the board, nursing, medical studies, etc., to list themselves and their work on the IAJU Migration Research Directory. This is an invaluable resource for scholars to find each other for interdisciplinary work in all parts of the world, but it's also a resource for the rest of us to find high-quality research and researchers, experts on migration and refugees in one common virtual space for the IAJU. So please ask your faculty to join and use the directory. The third element of the proposal is a compendium that we are assembling, an online compendium of best practices on the advocacy, teaching models, hospitality efforts, community engagement, immersion projects, and other initiatives that the schools are engaged in. We aren't asking you to fill out this compendium now, but we are asking through this QR code if you can send us the name of a contact at your institution. If we walked out of this assembly with contacts from each and every IAJU school, with respect to building this best practices compendium, it would be wonderful, and it is ready to be populated. We are ready to go with that. So we ask you to please send us now or sometime during the course of this week a name of a contact person at your school for the compendium. And then finally, we are looking at the fourth part of our proposal, which is a request to better coordinate our efforts. As we can see, not just from this discussion, but from the discussion happening in the room and on our home campuses, there is a lot going on in the IAJU with respect to efforts around migration and refugees in higher education. But we very often are unaware of each other's work. And so we are putting forward as a proposal to the board and to Father General a request for a coordinator among us, not to run these programs, but to facilitate communication and platforms of exchange so that what is happening in one part of the world is easily accessed by a school in another part of the world, and that it's easily accessed by our other apostolic partners in refugee-serving apostolates. So we want to thank you for this consideration. We hope that you will be raising these questions and this proposal in your regional meetings later in the week. Clearly, it is a moment for action. And so we are grateful for your energy and looking forward to your thoughts on this.
This is time also now for Q&A, and Alejandro is being, there is no questions. So I don't know if it's so clear, or probably we can open the floor. George, if you can, please open the microphone so that the people here in the auditorium, if they want to raise any questions or comments or suggestions, or please feel free.
Hello, I'm Megumi. I'm a student at Sophia University in Japan, studying and conducting research on refugees in Japan. I understand that there is a conventional definition of what a refugee is, but as was mentioned in the presentation, today there's a lack of opportunities in certain countries that force people to flee their homes in search for better job opportunities, arguably blurring the definition between what constitutes a refugee and a migrant. And with this, I wanted to ask your opinion on merits and demerits of differentiating or conflating laws, policies, support systems, and advocacy efforts between refugees and migrants. Thank you.
Thank you. I invite David. Do you be comfortable to answer?
Well, the definition of refugee that I presented is actually from the United Nations Declaration on the Status of Refugees. So it's an official legal definition, and it distinguishes a refugee from an internally displaced person, because a refugee, according to the legal definition, is only someone who has crossed an international border. And technically, in order to count as a refugee, you should be fleeing persecution. But the United Nations High Commissioner for the Refugees has broadened the definition of persecution to include people fleeing from war, but not yet fleeing from poverty or not fleeing from environmental displacement. So this raises a host of questions for us about their international responsibilities, because some people have advocated that the definition of refugees should be open for reconsideration. On the other hand, Antonio Guterres, the present Secretary General of the United Nations, when he was High Commissioner for Refugees, which is the highest official in the United Nations system in response to refugees, said that's a bad idea, because he said, given the world we're in today, if we open the definition of refugee for reconsideration, it would probably be made more restrictive rather than more inclusive. But what that does not mean that we do not have serious moral responsibilities toward migrants, internally displaced people, people fleeing from environmental displacement, even though we may not have the same legal requirements. So law and morality are not to be identified.
Thank you, David. Please.
Yes, good afternoon and thank you. My name is Sammy Hellowa. I'm a president of Campion College in Regina, Saskatchewan, which is in Canada. My question is on the role of the university, Jesuit University, in educating about refugees to our benefactors, to the donors. How do you see that role playing out, especially given what the media say about refugees not always accurate? And so since education institutions are supposed to work for accurate information and presentation of people who are marginalized, like refugees or displaced people. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any one of you? Maria?
You raise an excellent question, and I'm a faculty member, so I don't usually get access to our donors so much. The experience, though, that I've had is more with grant writing, and that is the challenge, right? Educating potential funders about the need and why we should fund services and supports.
Sammy, as a former refugee, I don't know where you're sitting now, sorry, I'm just looking for you, but you yourself could probably provide the best response to this. I would just add to what Maria said, that we spent the better part of this day talking, and yesterday talking about encounter. And I don't know that there's anything that really substitutes for that. Donors are not a different species, meeting them at their heart. So the question for me is, what are the venues for encounter that are possible? Some of those are in person, some of those are in recorded or reading material, some of those are in discussion with the rest of us, but there is really nothing that substitutes for that. And actually, that's a really outstanding question, and I would hope that we can follow up on that later in the week too.
Thank you, please.
Could I add one point there?
Yeah, of course.
It seems about the response of Jesuit universities. It brings back memories to me. A place like Boston College was founded to respond to the needs of Irish immigrants and refugees, people fleeing the famine in Ireland, arrived here in Boston, and this university was begun to respond to their needs. and to help them integrate into the community in which they had just arrived. We have the same kind of responsibility to the 100 million people in the world today who've been driven from their home. And if you add to that 100 million, the additional fleeing poverty and fleeing migration migrating because of environment, the responsibility is at least as great as the responsibilities of the people who founded this institution to respond to Irish migrants.
Thank you, David. Please.
Thank you. To reintroduce myself again, I'm Chizito Chiyimba, provincial of Eastern African Province. Now, when you look at the map of Africa, you will notice that East Africa sits in a privileged position to have so many refugees. In the northeast, we have the Horn of Africa. There is a war raging in Ethiopia as we speak. Somalia is in disarray. And then to the southwest, we have the Great Lakes, and there's a war raging there. So we are caught between the two. Now, the Father General mandated us to build a university in Western Kenya, Molo, Hekima University. And sometimes I've stood up to talk about my vision for that university, and I've said it's a university for the poor. And I think I'm not exaggerating if I say that most of our students, when we eventually start to run, will have a refugee experience or a displaced person's experience. That's going to be our reality. So we want to build a university for the poor, a university for refugees. We have signed a memorandum of understanding with JWL. Now, the elephant in the room is higher education a basic human right, or is it a privilege? In the economics of higher education, is there a model where you can build a university for the poor, or am I building castles in the air? Is it possible to have a university for the poor? So that's the situation I find myself in. And economists, ethicists, everyone is welcome to help me answer this question. Thank you.
Rampe, do you want to, or David?
Well, I would just go back about the issue about founding a university to respond to the needs of the poor. I mean, speaking from the United States context, that's where Jesuit education came from. Most of the universities in this country that are Jesuit sponsored were founded to respond to the needs of poor immigrants. And so that's where we come from. It seems to me there's plenty of room for doing it or trying to find new ways of doing it again.
If I may add for a second, I think there is a connection between these two questions, right? The one previous about the donors. I think until we select donors for the values that we actually represent, we're not going to be able to, quote unquote, sell to them universities that cater to the least powerful. And I realize that this is a conundrum for capitalist systems like the one I live in, but it is also the reality of the contradiction between how we fund universities and how we promote their values. And it is perhaps a sad fact that I can only think of one institution in the US that is, quote unquote, for the poor, which is Berea College. Right, that is supported completely by alumni and through the work done in that university, and essentially it funds itself through alumni donations who know that they have to support another generation of students who are as underprivileged as they are. But I cannot think of another one in the entirety of the United States, and that's I think tell us something.
I'm probably going back to what the Father Arturo Sosa said in the morning. It's about discernment. So the challenge for us in the universities is really to discern where do we want to put the heart and where this discernment will lead us. And thinking creatively, taking risks. I mean, like going beyond our current models, what can we imagine to really structurally and effectively, and that's probably part of the job of the advancement and planning teams in each institution, to really see what is possible to make a connection, a practical connection. I mean, there are many structural questions, things that need to be sorted out, funding. So, but it's about dreaming, and it's about taking risks, and it's about really acting accordingly, our discernment.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yeah, Rampe, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think you asked one important question, is tertiary education a basic human right? Looking at our situation in our continent, Africa, today, you can't live a dignified life without a tertiary qualification. People who have primary and secondary education, they're struggling to make ends meet. So does that make tertiary education a basic human right? I would say it's something that we need. I would say yes. In South Africa at the moment, we've had many students protesting in some of the tertiary institutions, demanding that tertiary education be made a basic human right and being made free for especially the poor, because we have many people who are in what we call the missing middle, who after qualifying, they spend a lot of time trying to pay back the bursaries and the tertiary loans that they received when they were students in universities, and basically they barely making ends meet. So it becomes a challenge for us, especially for the poor. And given that the majority of our people in Africa, they living either below the poverty line or just on the poverty line. So that would make it, for me, in my opinion, basic human rights, or yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Rampe. I think it's almost time. I think on behalf of our companions here, we want to thank you, all of you. Also invite all the delegates, the presidents, to strongly consider our proposal so that you can also follow. And also tomorrow, we can continue the conversation in room 214. We'll have our task force also, and try to deep a little bit more in some of our projects. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie and Alberto, and for others who gave us a very inspiring and very challenging panel. And this is in tune with our UAP 2, to walk with the poor. And it's challenging for us. Also, thanks to JWL and JRS, who are working very closely with migrants and refugees. And we will work together, and we'll also find ways to collaborate, because this is the heart of the society. We will do it. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. We will have a short break of 20 minutes. We come back at 2:55 here. Thank you very much. When you come back, kindly pick up the translation device here, because we may have in both English and Spanish. It will be useful for you. Thank you.